Good morning and welcome once again to Elevenses. I'm Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training, and this is my twice weekly live webcast. And good morning to Clive and Christine, who are both here. Nice to see you too. Right, what have we got for you today? Well, fairly packed show again, as usual. We have a headline story. The residents in Paris have voted to ban e-step scooters completely. I'll go back to that story at the end of the show as well and have a look at the problem in a little bit more depth. A consultation is taking place to cut more speed limits in London. East Sussex is spending £500,000 to identify where A and B road speed limits could be reduced. A free advice hub for novice bikers has appeared, funded by RoSPA. Facial recognition is said to be coming to BMW's bikes, and at the same time BMW have also announced a recall because a software update has actually turned off the launch control on particular models without warning the rider first. And in racing, Energica have scored a 5th place against ICE powered bikes on the Daytona banking, which I think is a fairly significant day. And in today's discussion point, as I said, we'll go back to looking at the e-step scooter ban in Paris and ask whether it's actually the right decision or not. So settle yourselves down for the next 30 odd minutes whilst I take you through all those news stories. Now, first of all, of course, don't forget the current events, which include a presentation on sports psychology. It's the second of two. I covered the first one just a few weeks ago. Now the date has been changed. The date there says Wednesday the 5th of April, but due to a clash of dates tonight, unfortunately, I've got friends over from Germany that I wasn't expecting. We are going to be out this evening, so no show tonight. It will go out on the 12th instead, so second Wednesday of the month, the 12th, and that will be looking, as I say, at sports psychology. Now, sports psychology is an interdisciplinary science. It draws on knowledge from many related fields, and riding a bike, of course, isn't all about technical ability, though we often tend to think it is, because it's actually our mental abilities that allow us to use our practical skills to best advantage, and that's where sports psychology really will come in. So during the talk, I'll offer some simple, easy to use routines straight from that science to help you get your head in the right place and get your race face on, ready to face the world on two wheels. So do look in for that if you possibly can. As usual, there is a sign up page to give you, and that is here. And Terry has looked in as well. Good morning to you, Terry, or good evening, of course, over in your part of the world, rather late in the evening. So nice to see you putting in an appearance from New Zealand. Right, okay, so on with the news. Now, the first story of the day is actually all about e-step scooters. Now, you know, I would say that, frankly, feelings on these things are probably mixed, but the vote went to the Parisians on Sunday, and on whether or not the rental e-step scooters should actually be removed from the streets of the French capital. And the result of this mini referendum, which actually fewer than 10% of the population turned out to vote, was an overwhelming 90% in favour of the ban. Now that means the 15,000 for hire e-step scooters currently on the streets of Paris will now vanish at the end of August when the city's contracts with the 3 rental operators expires. Now, Anne Hidalgo, who is the mayor of the city, she has supported numerous sustainable travel methods like walking and cycling, whilst also banning free motorcycle parking and older vehicles from the city centre, incidentally. But she described step scooters as a source of tension and worry, and she said the vote sent a very clear message. So, you know, really, frankly, in terms of an integrated transport policy for the future, I think it simply muddies the waters and actually reflects media horror stories rather than reality. Stay tuned to the end of the show and I'll actually have a look at that story in more depth. Terry says Germans turning up expectedly. It's all right. No problems there, Terry. And Kevin's looked in as well. Nice to see you. Right, so here in the capital, of course, we have numerous 20 zones, and now Transport for London is consulting on whether to introduce around 40 miles of new 20 mile per hour speed limits through 8 of the capital's boroughs, which, with the exception of Kensington and Chelsea, are all south of the Thames. They are Greenwich, Lewisham, Southwark, Wandsworth, Merton, Bromley and Lambeth. Now, if the proposal goes through, and I can hardly see it failing to, frankly, the work to introduce these new lower limits on TfL's routes, which, remember, cover the main roads into and around London, they would include stretches of the South Circular, for example. It could begin as early as September this year. Now, they say banners would be attached to street limits to help drivers realise that there's a new 20 in force. But the TfL also says they'll be working closely with the Met Police to ensure that drivers understand and comply with them, whilst existing speed cameras would have their enforcement threshold changed to reflect the new speed limit. It would be really nice if, for a time, for example, they actually sent out warnings rather than tickets, but whether that'll happen, who knows. Meanwhile, down in leafy East Sussex, the county council there has announced that they are going to spend £500,000 to fund an assessment of all A and B roads to ensure speed limits are what they call appropriate, which I suspect really means that they are looking for places where they think they should be reduced, because frankly I would be amazed if they found some inappropriately low limits and actually raised them. Now, it doesn't seem to be any part of the remit within the current reviews of speed limits anywhere. Anyway, since the press release said that over the next 3 years, that project will see more than 25 stretches of roads benefit from what they call speed limit reductions, or measures that will increase the effectiveness of existing speed limits. So it seems to me they pretty much already know where they want to put in lower limits. Now, the skeptic in me, of course, does say more speed cameras, but the press release also talks about vehicle activated signs, which I think are actually quite important. They're quite effective in reducing excess speed, because they do remind people who may have otherwise missed a speed limit sign. Something I've been talking about in my series of Focus on Friday posts, actually, where I've been talking about the sort of involuntary, unintended violations of rules. And they'll also put up new signage and lining. Now, rather scarily, the council actually intends to gather real-time speeds of vehicles from the GPS trackers, which are inside most modern vehicles, unbeknownst to the driver in many cases, of course, as well as using the more conventional speed surveys and the permanent vehicle counters, which are fitted to many of our trunk roads to record both traffic passing and its speed. So I do hope that the in-car data is suitably anonymised. Now, just to remind you, you are tuned to Elevenses this morning. I'm Kevin Williams and this is my show. If you do want to catch it live, it goes out Wednesdays and Sundays, nearly always live, occasionally recorded, and even more rarely I do miss a show. But if you want to catch up, the easiest place to do it is over on my YouTube channel, which is, no, that's the wrong button. I'll get that on the right one in a moment. Nope, I've got the wrong button altogether. So it's, I've moved them all around. They're not in the places I remember them to be. So whilst I'm doing this with one hand, sort of one eye on the script, I'm looking at the buttons to press, and I pressed the wrong one. So okay, anyway, that's where we are. YouTube, if you want to find me there to catch up on old shows or anything else. Meanwhile, as you probably know, I'm a month back or so, a month from the end of the Shiny Side Up events in New Zealand, which are delivered free at a number of venues to motorcyclists across the country. And I've been talking about whether or not something like that should be done here. Well, I discovered that RoSPA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, are actually creating what they call a free advice hub for motorcyclists, for novice motorcyclists in particular. Here's a picture of what the sort of screen looks like. The Novice Hub was launched as part of the Motorcycle Safety Week, and it aims to educate bikers using video tutorials on topics such as how to maintain the bike, what gear to wear, how to tackle T-junctions and left-hand turns safely and effectively. There will also be question and answer sessions for those interested in learning how to ride. Now, David Walker, who is the head of RoSPA, he said, rather optimistically in my opinion, and my experience of teaching young riders, that the hub is a one-stop shop for everything a young rider needs to know. Now, covering everything is a vast and unachievable goal, frankly. Focusing on the absolute necessities of staying alive, I think, would be far more sensible, but hey-ho. He continued, when you're a young adult and keen to get out and about, having your own transport is exciting and liberating. We would encourage all parents of young adults who ride a motorcycle to check it out and encourage their child to do the same. Knowledge saves lives. Look at the language there. To encourage their child. Yes, I know. Technically children, yes, but I think you're kind of almost talking down to them there, aren't you? And frankly, how many of us took a great deal of notice what our parents thought in our late teenage years? I know I was off doing my own thing with only minimal input from my parents. So will the advice hub have any effect on what RoSPA say is an increase in death and injuries amongst younger riders? Well, only time will tell. But speaking personally, I'm going to say right now that they'll struggle to get attention with the TikTok generation unless their videos are very slick indeed. Now I'm just going to put one link up for you on the screen there. That's to one of their videos, which is called New Rider Skill Up. Have a watch of it after the show, hopefully, and tell me what you think. They also, frankly, need to do a far better job with their press release. Now, I found the story about this particular hub on the BBC. That alerted me to go and look it up and find out what it was all about. But the BBC story actually failed to carry any onward link to the hub itself. So I'll do the job for RoSPA. There is the link if you would like to go and have a look at their hub for new riders. Right, okay, so anything else I was going to say? If you do miss a show, don't forget you can head over to my Ko-fi page. That's the wrong button again. We'll get the right button in a moment. There it is. You can, if you buy me a cuppa over there, gets you access to hundreds of better biking articles too. So if you do enjoy the show, do pop over there, have a look. Plenty of free stuff to read, of course. But if you do find it worthwhile, drop me a cuppa and you get access to all the back catalogue from my Facebook posts, currently 9 years or so of them. Right, okay, now I've been saying for as long as I've been presenting ELEVENSES that the motorcycle industry needs to do more to proof bikes against theft, but I have to say that the story that came out on Monday strikes me as more suitable for an April Fool. Now, BMW is said to be ready to use facial recognition with iris cornea comparison with the owner for added security, replacing the conventional key. Now, how this will work is that there'll be electronics integrated into the TFT display of the motorbike cockpit. That'll perform a 3D scan of the rider's face, and then the image is compared with a data set stored in the system. And if the comparison is positive, the ignition, the steering lock and other locking functions are released and the rider can start the motorcycle. Since the 3D scan works with infrared illumination, they say this type of face recognition also works in the dark and doesn't dazzle the rider. Now, should the face match, then all is hunky-dory. But if it doesn't, then BMW iFace, as the technology is called, will communicate with the emergency call center eCall, and using a special coding, not only does the BMW Motorrad call center receive a corresponding message assuming an attempted theft, but the scan data, face and eye, as well as the current geographical location, are all transmitted to the International Central Database of the Federal Police Authorities in parallel. Which again, of course, leads me to ask questions about privacy. You know, if it's a false alarm, you've just told everybody where you are. How do you actually turn that off? I have no idea. How will it work in practice too is a good question. I have no idea what the answer to that is, but what I can say is that the news report says that there will be a special polarization filter which allows the eye scan to pass through heavily tinted and even mirrored visors, as well as glasses and contact lenses. But the 3D face scan presumably needs you to have your helmet off. It's not going to work properly if you're wearing a helmet. So quite how that works, I don't know. But similar technology built into smartphones, of course, can be accurate if the camera gets clear view of the user's face and in a well-lit environment, but accuracy can drop significantly in low light environments. Presumably that's why the BMW iFace system is relying on infrared. But the facial recognition technology, you know, has been fooled. You can fool it with a photo or even a video of the user's face. And one tech site has said that facial recognition should only ever be used alongside other security measures, such as strong password or two-factor authentication. So that's for your phone, which is worth a few £100. What about your motorcycle, which is worth thousands of pounds? I wouldn't have no idea what you would do if the integrated electronics fails either, which is, you know, with electronics is not entirely unlikely. So presumably keeping a key as a backup isn't an option. Doesn't seem like it is. And of course it doesn't stop the bike being removed in a van with the software or even the hardware which runs the software being cracked at leisure. I still would like to see the emphasis being put onto physical security to make it harder to actually move the bike in the first place. I'd be interested in your thinking on that too. Now, the risk of relying rather too much on software-based solutions to riding motorcycles should be obvious really from this next story too, which also ironically in some ways concerns BMW and a technology-laden bike, namely their top-selling S1000R and the S1000XR models, and that's because BMW Motorrad is actually carrying out a recall on these particular bikes. Now, what's happened? Well, according to BMW, following a software update, any custom settings for Dynamic Pro mode are reset to factory settings, which means takeoff detection is disabled. But this apparently happens without the customer being informed of the reset. So, quote, as a result, the front wheel lift will neither be suppressed nor controlled, increasing the risk of an accident. So basically, if you're in the habit of nailing the throttle away from the lights and expecting the electronics to control the machine, you could flip the bike. Now, the models affected were manufactured between April the 3rd, 2019 up to December the 20th, 2022. It's not clear from the recall notice whether the update is actually performed without your knowledge over the air, as it does happen with some cars, or whether it's out of service. But it's worrying really that the manufacturer can actually break your bike remotely, whatever the mode of transmission. Now, I do seem to be playing the role of cynic rather effectively this morning, so let's turn to a story with what I think are some pretty positive notes. Now, I mentioned a few shows back that the US e-bike manufacturer Energica was actually about to become the first to put their machinery up against ICE bikes in an open class of motorcycle racing. And there you have a photograph of the Energica on the grid in the middle of a bunch of other motorcycles. And the results from this first round, it's the Super Hooligan National Championship in the Moto America Series, won't have been a disappointment to the manufacturer. Stefano Mesa, he first made history by placing his Titler's cycle racing Energica Eva Rebel RS. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? How commentators ever get these names out without stumbling over them is always amazes me. Anyway, he put that particular bike into 7th place in the first race, thus making history because it was the first time an electric machine had raced competitively against petrol engine bikes and it was in a field comprising mostly Indian FTR 1200s and a sprinkling of Harley Davidsons, and he improved on that to 5th in the second of the 2 races at the series being held at the Daytona International Speedway in Florida, USA, as part of Daytona Speed Week. So the team said that the successful performance at Daytona was anything but a given because of their previous lack of data or even race experience with the Dunlop tyres. There were also questions voiced on the commentary about whether the Energica's battery would actually last the distance on a high-speed circuit, which is almost certainly not one that would favour an electric motorcycle, and whether the rider would actually be forced to dial down the power to make it to the finish line. Well, apparently not. I know that many people still don't believe an electric motor can ever substitute for the ICE, but I'd say this is a small step to showing that they are genuine contenders out there. The series resumes for round 2 at the Ridge Motorsports Park in Shelton, which is in Washington State, but you'll have to wait till June the 23rd, 25th to see that particular race series. Right, so Terry's got something to say here. Let's just put that on screen. Simply supplying a learning resource for young riders is a pretty hopeless means of making noddy riders safer. Heavily focused social engineering to improve teenagers' attitude might help, but a passive website sitting there forlornly waiting to be taken up is something that might make politicians and bureaucrats feel better, but that would be about it. Well, at the risk of sounding a bit cynical, I kind of agree. You know, this isn't the first intervention which has been aimed at new riders, but if you go to YouTube and you search for the top videos on motorcycling, you're not going to find them. Terry also says riding motorcycles at the mercy of remote tweaking would be anathema to me. Unless it warned you your chain was too loose. Yes, less said about your chain, Terry, the better probably. But yeah, it is slightly worrying, I think, that you can tweak software over the air and basically get it wrong. But it's the model that Tesla have been using, and there are plenty of people willing to drive a Tesla car and hope for the best there. Yeah, okay, so definitely a point of debate. And I'm sure there'll be lots of people with different opinions on that one too. So, all right, back to the opening story of the day. What's behind the ban on the e-step scooters in Paris? Now, Paris was seen as a world leader in adopting these vehicles because they thought they were environmentally friendly. They introduced them back in 2018. Most of us had to wait till sort of lockdown for something to happen. So the upcoming ban has actually caused some considerable consternation amongst those who believe that the electric step scooters are part of the solution to mobility, not just around Paris, but around the rest of the world, rather than a problem. And it turns out that the vote that was cast, it was 90% against them continuing the trials in Paris, you'll recall, but it may have been just 8% of the people who were entitled to vote who actually came out and voted. So one comment said that people were too busy rioting to vote. Well, it didn't take long, of course, for people in the UK to see this vote and then start to call for similar measures in the UK. For example, Jonathan White, who is the Legal and Compliance Director at the National Accident Helpline, he commented on the ban to the Daily Express website, and he said, quote, Paris has voted to ban for hire electric scooters from the streets of the French capital after a referendum was called in response to a rising number of people being injured and killed on e-scooters. And he called on Transport for London to carefully consider the safety of the travelling public in the UK. Well, just a small point there, but of course Transport for London only cover London, not the UK. But anyway, he carried on. He said, whilst the intention behind e-scooters was to offer an alternative to public transport, greener option than cars, the rampant use of e-scooters, private e-scooters, is evading public authorities and is becoming the cause of an increasing number of road accidents and injuries to pedestrians. Our research shows that the majority of Brits, 63%, want e-scooters banned from public roads, whilst 3/4 believe a driving licence and insurance should be a requirement for using an e-scooter. He said, quote, it's crucial that regulation is put in place to curb the illegal and dangerous use of private e-scooters, as Williams reinforced the rules for rental schemes too. Well, for Jonathan White's information, of course, there are plenty of perfectly clear and enforceable regulations to curb their, quote, dangerous and illegal use, including the one that scares a lot of people, riding them on pavements. The difficulties may be policing those rules through forces up and down the country, but they are seizing scooters on the spot. They are prosecuting people. But more to the point, it's the almost total lack of control on the sale of illegal e-scooters which really matters. Now, just a few days ago, TfL's Director of Strategy and Innovation, a chap called Thomas Abelman, he specifically called out the retailer Halfords over the sale of illegal e-scooters. When asked by members of TfL's Customer Service and Operational Performance panel why TfL cannot simply block retailers from selling private e-scooters, he said, I think getting Halfords to stop selling unsafe e-scooters is going to be really tricky. And he was referring here to Will Norman, the cycling commissioner. He said Will has written several times to them to ask them to label that those are not permitted to be used on the public roads. Those labels are there, but they're very small and you'd never notice them. He did go on to mention that other retailers are available, but frankly this is a job for trading standards to get involved with. They have the power to prevent the sale of items like this. Now, coming back to the National Accident Helpline's Jonathan White's statement, it's all very well to talk about education of prospective riders and clear information on their use, but I'm convinced that there are two issues here which can't be addressed by clear information. The fact that the rental bikes are expensive when compared to buying one from your favourite retailer, and the fact that you can't always lay your hands on a legal one anyway. So for Lime, for example, here in London, if you want to ride one, you have to pay up £1 basically to start your journey, and then every minute you're actually on the machine it's 15p. Now 20-minute ride therefore costs you £4. Now it doesn't sound much, but if you need to ride back again, that's £8. Do that 4 times a week, that's 36 quid. You can buy a private scooter from your favourite retailer for £400. That's 11 weeks use. And with strictly limited trial areas, of course, many prospective riders can't get to use one at all, or they try to cross the ring-fenced area and the scooter cuts out. Now, the Express's own poll puts the figure of those wanting e-step scooters banned as high as 87%, but it would really be interesting to know how many of those voters actually voted from inside the trial area. There are other studies from the sort of retailers organisation for e-scooters that suggest around 50% of people are actually in favour of e-step scooters on the roads. So you have two conflicting polls there, and I suspect both have probably influenced the results by talking to the people that they want to talk to. So the question really is, are e-step scooters actually the menace that the more rabid end of the press would like us to believe? Well, the hot potato, as I said, is illegal riding on pavements, and almost everyone has a story of the time they were nearly hit by a recklessly ridden e-scooter. I can tell you one myself. But that's effectively tarring the many who do ride them sensibly and don't collide with you. Exactly the same thing I keep saying about motorcycle crashes with the few who don't. The same goes for car drivers and cyclists as well, of course. We see the bad apples, we don't see the many, many more who ride and drive them sensibly. Now, it's also believed that e-step scooters are more dangerous than bicycles in terms of non-fatal injuries, especially for inexperienced riders. Now, I guess the implication here, given that inexperienced cyclists can quite happily fall off and injure themselves too, is that it's the e-step scooter which is less stable. And that's kind of supported by the fact that most injuries from e-step scooter use that come through the system are to the rider alone. So couldn't we tackle that by specifying some improved design features for legally sold vehicles in exactly the same way we do with cars and motorcycles? For example, bigger wheels would probably be a good place to start, as would be effective brakes and lighting. Others say that the riders are vulnerable in traffic. Well, there have been injuries and deaths, of course, no one would dispute that. And we have the numbers. According to the Department for Transport here in the UK, there were 484 casualties in accidents involving e-scooters in Great Britain in 2020, of which 384 were the riders themselves. There was one person killed. Now, the growth in the problem is visible because by 2022 figures which didn't include all of December but most of it, that figure had actually risen to 14 deaths. So that's a significant growth in usage. But what is the scale? Well, the ownership is calculated there are over 1 million e-scooters in the country, and it's estimated that of those, around 750,000 are actually in use on the roads. And of course, the vast majority of those are illegal. Now, over in Paris in 2022, there were 3 fatal accidents and reported 451 injuries. That's around 1 in 10 of the total number of fatal injuries which result from collisions on the road, including motorcyclists, cyclists and pedestrians too. Yet it's estimated in Paris that journeys taken on the e-scooters have replaced as many as 20% of journeys which would otherwise have been taken by cars. So that is actually getting cars off the road, and you're transferring those journeys to e-scooters. So it's not surprising that there are going to be some crashes. So perhaps they're not the menace that they are painted out to be. Now, an article in the Independent here pointed out that the main area of concern is that, quote, people seem to be unnerved by how fast they go. And the writer then went on to point out that in central Paris, cars are actually stuck at an average speed of 8 miles per hour. Not by any legislation, of course, but simply by how many of them there are trying to cram onto the roads. And similar figures actually hold for traffic in London, as it happens. Now, when sharing the roads rather than riding on the pavement, which I think is another issue altogether, I think what unnerves drivers, certainly unnerves me sometimes when I'm driving, is the fact that they can travel a lot faster in congested traffic than cars. But the same applies to bicycles and, dare I say it, motorcycles too. Another objection I hear time and again is the streets weren't designed for them. Well, the fact is most city streets weren't designed for the car either. Much of the inner cities of Paris and London were laid out in the 19th century, well before the internal combustion engine was attached to some wheels. The vast majority of roads, for instance, in central London and in the various villages, such as Hampstead, for example, just up the road from here, they were absorbed into the city during its growth period. And these areas were all designed for pedestrians, horses and horse-drawn vehicles as much as they were designed anywhere. Witness the huge number of mews, for example, in central London, which were originally stables. But by and large, we have actually managed to adapt the roads we've got to fit the age of the motor car and the motorcycle. Nevertheless, there are grandiose sounding statements, such as one by that writer in The Independent who said, what's needed is to, quote, return Europe's great cities to the old livable ways for which they were intended. Well, here's a more realistic view. The cities we have now, which include the suburbs around the outside of those historic centres, grew because there was access to public transport. The very street I live on in northwest London is here entirely because of the extension of the Metropolitan Railway out into what was formerly countryside. And the road network adapted to cope with the growth of the railways. What happened then was that the gaps between the ribbons that followed the railways, they were filled in when cars actually began to allow people to get around in areas where trains didn't run and beyond the distances where people can comfortably walk or cycle. And there's a growing myth that cycling predates the car. The indie writer says, for example, Paris was laid out in the 19th century with 2 use types in mind, the pedestrian and the bicycle. Is that actually true? Well, have a look at this photograph. The reality is somewhat different. This is central Paris, 1910. Can you see a bicycle in sight in that picture? Well, I can't. I went back another 20 years, incidentally, and had a look at photos from 1890. Now, that's just a couple of years after the safety bicycle was invented. Cars were still in the minority, a rarity on the roads at that point, and again, no cycles. So let's have a look somewhere else for some evidence. This is 1910, and this is central London. Any bicycles in that one? Not that I can see. Plenty of horse-drawn vehicles, plenty of primitive motor cars, and lots of pedestrians wandering around in the road because everything moved quite slowly at that point, but no bicycles. I did look harder because I actually positively discriminated in my search for bicycles, and I did find one photograph with some bicycles in. So I'll just zoom in there, and if you look there, there's a cyclist riding along in the road. Or is he just holding on to a moving car? Hard to say, really. And there's one over there on the pavement, wheeling her bicycle, and somewhere up in the distance there looked as if there was another one up there somewhere. I thought I saw another bicycle. Yes, there we go. There's one down there in the corner. So yes, there are some bicycles in that photo, but you know, the point I'm making here is that the idea that there's cars force cycles off the road is absolute nonsense. So really what happened is that the car replaced horse-drawn transport, not cycling. The early days of cycling happened at the same time as petrol-driven transport became the norm. Now, it hasn't always been a happy marriage between cycling and car driving, and the recent boom, though, in cycling has seen the roads being adapted once again, this time to try to accommodate bicycles more easily. So I think the question that we should be asking here before we start banning e-step scooters is what's missing from the rest of the transport system so many people actually want to use them. That really is the question that we need to answer. Now, I think if we can freely adapt on the same streets to mix in cyclists, I don't believe that we can't adapt to fit in e-scooters as well as incorporating, for what it's worth, fully powered e-bikes for those who, for one reason or another, aren't able to pedal a bicycle. My partner, for example, with her metal knees, would find cycling, even an assisted bike, very difficult indeed. And the more freedom that we have to travel short distances using novel forms of transport like this, the fewer cars that will be making the same journeys. But here, I think, is a crucial point to have a ponder. People like to be consulted on issues, and then they complain when they don't get the result they wanted because other people actually thought differently. And it's usually, of course, people who shout no who make themselves heard. They are the ones who tend to shout loudest. So I think we need to be very cautious about going the same way in the UK and holding a referendum on the issue, because we kind of know how that goes in the UK. As you've seen, you'll almost certainly find that there is a healthy majority in favour of putting e-scooters on ice in any poll which has a simple yes/no answer. Now, other surveys, as I said, do suggest there's up to 50% in favour of e-step scooters, and I guess these are the people who simply didn't bother to turn out in Paris, probably thinking that a positive result was a given. And, you know, frankly, it's dangerous setting precedents where small but vocal minorities can get their way. And I think that if you put the question, should we ban motorcycles, to a vote, the outlook for powered two-wheelers in this country would be looking very grim indeed. There are always enough haters who will turn out and help swing a poll. And it's even worse when you put small groups of people in power. We've seen in Hackney over the last few months how a small group with an agenda can use what I think are pretty underhanded means to try to push motorcycles and scooters off their roads by essentially pricing bikers out of parking on them. Now, just imagine handing that council the referendum powers to ask whether or not we could even ride bikes into their patch. Right, Terry says, he said that the avenues were laid out to facilitate the movement of cavalry around every time the peasants built a barricade. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I think it was a much longer process than sort of the end of the Napoleonic era. But anyway, whatever. The point is that, you know, there are grand designs in any city building, and there is the sort of they just happen to grow at parts of those cities as well. So yeah, but they go back long before bicycles, cars, and e-scooters. We just have to adapt to fit them, or we're into some kind of Soviet style blitzing of the landscape and rebuilding it into a new model, which I don't think is what anybody would want. Right, that is it for today. I think I've ranted long enough about e-step scooters and everything else going on in the world today. The sun has come out after a fashion since I've been talking here today. It was we had 2 lovely sunny days. And today is turning a little bit brighter than it was first thing. So if you are out there on your bike today, do remember to stay shiny side up.